Good morning or good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are. It's 11 o'clock in Rwanda and might be 12 o'clock East African time. My name is Robert Ganzamore and I'm part of Share Screen Africa team. For the audience, I asked you to type the country you're from and the organization you work for to better know each other. And yeah, welcome to the third talk of the series titled Can Wildlife and Agriculture Coexist? An East African Perspective. Today's topic of discussion is farming bees alongside Canola, a Kenya example. And our speaker today is called Jess DeBoer, a farmer, an author, a chief, beekeeper, and a lifelong student of the soil. Born and raised in Nairobi, she has spent the last decade working across the East and Horn of Africa in the regenerative agriculture sector. She's focused on facilitating the mainstream adoption of biologically complex and commercially viable land use practices across both tropical and dry land, and is deeply committed to shaping the development of a regenerative African story, making farming cool again. So we're going to follow the same itinerary. This discussion is going to end for 1 hour. And before our speaker ends her presentation, please type your questions in the chat section and we'll come back to them after the presentation. So without further ado, Jess, the screen is yours. Thank you.
So as Robert said, I am a farmer, a beekeeper, and a few other things, but my heart is out in the field, and in the field, in the soil, but also in the creatures that float around it. And I've been very privileged to grow up in a part of the world where bees certainly are still quite abundant. The picture on the right-hand side of the screen is all the bees of sub-Saharan Africa. Most people just know the honeybee, or when you say a bee, they either think of a big fat bumblebee or the honeybee. But we have so many different types of bees. Some are solitary, some live in the ground, some make nests out of petals. So much diversity out there. And there are 30,000 different bee species in the world. We've only described just over half of them in terms of scientific naming. And for those joining, if there are any from South Africa, 1,200 bee species are just from South Africa. So it's just an extraordinary diversity of creatures that most people don't know exist. And if they do, they're very different to the black and yellow bottomed honeybees, whose product we all enjoy on toast or cereal or something like that. So yeah, my talk today is very much focused on the honeybee, because it's the only insect or certainly bee species that we have really, I guess, commercialized. There are some other native or some species that we have also commercialized just for pollination services. So across the world, people export bumblebees to pollinate certain crops. It's a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Luckily, where I sit here in the shadow of Mount Kenya up in Timau, we have enough native bees out there where we're not having to buy in pollinators to pollinate our crops. But it's something that we should never ever take for granted. Just because they're there today doesn't mean that they're not tomorrow, as is the fate of so many wild creatures out there. I know we had a plague of locusts about a year and a half ago. It was pretty bad, and there was a very strong spray program that was put in place by local government, but it was pretty damaging to all of insect life, not just the locusts. So yeah, us humans are pretty phenomenal at putting our own priorities first, and that has big implications for wildlife. And bees for me are wildlife. They just different to the elephants and the giraffes that some people associate with that word. Golly, I've already started to waffle, sorry. What I will do, so the picture on the left is a farm, one of the farms I work on. I wish I had my own farm, but when you don't have vast amounts of productive land yourself, you work for a company that does. So my job initially was to put in a commercial beekeeping enterprise on some of these broadacre farms on and around Mount Kenya. So they are arable farms growing wheat and barley, which are the two lower fields, and then that big yellow square up in the top right-hand corner of the photo is canola, and then it looks like peas on the left. So I'll discuss the kind of soil side of how we farm, because it's just another pizza slice of the bigger whole that that we must discuss when we're talking about any single creature in isolation. There's a whole world around it that allows it to survive and thrive. So I was tasked with putting in a commercial beekeeping enterprise to try and value add on a crop that already has value addition purpose. So for Agventure, which is the name of the company I work for, we process canola into an oil, a cold pressed oil, and it's a brilliant break crop in a cereal based system. So it gives the soil a bit of a breather from cereals, and it allows you to kind of diversify the microorganism life in the soil. And the same for peas. It's another break crop between the cereals and the wheats. And we're looking at sunflowers also, which comes into its own for bees as well. So that was my job. And it's explained in a kind of farming front. In 2010 and before, there were several farms that were just growing wheat and barley, so very much monocropping. And they were seeing the same thing happens, that happens worldwide when you treat the soil poorly. And I use the analogy of the human body. When you plant just wheat on wheat on wheat year after year, you are depleting the soil of very specific nutrients. And it's the same, the analogy would be as a human body being fed only one type of food. So the example would be a plate of beans. So just beans, no onions, no sauce, just beans, and you eat that day on day on day. Yes, you will be getting some nutrition from those beans, but there will be certain key ingredients that you are lacking, and over time that will compound, and you will be very malnutritioned at the end of 20 years, forget one, or one, forget 20 years. So what happens when you cause malnutrition in soils? It's the same as the human body. It weakens, it's more prone to diseases, and you're at risk from so many risk factors. So then when you bring in more diversity, so that's planting material, so you bring in your canola, you bring in your peas and your sunflowers to a four-way rotation, you're suddenly having this enormous spike of diversity, because different plants take out different things in the soil, but they also put different things into the soil. So suddenly the human body that was just fed beans is now able to have a glass of milk, to have a piece of fruit, and maybe some starch, maybe a potato. And if you've just eaten beans, that you're gonna experience a similar increase in reaction to those increased nutrients, and it's going to be an initial boost for your own gut bacteria, much like it does in the soil with the soil microlife. So that's what Agventure has just come through in terms of the 10-year journey we've taken to introduce canola and peas. At the same time, we're human beings, so we have to make those crops pay. This isn't, we're not an NGO, we're a for-profit company, and it's something that so many people don't like to talk about. You've got to make money, and if you can make money and improve the soil, you're onto a winning streak. but you can never get complacent in that, because after the four-way rotation, you've got to continue expanding. It's got to get to 6, it's got to get to 10, and our target is 20. But you've got to make sure that you are earning money through those crops as you go. So profitability has to go hand in hand with resilience of your farming system and mitigation against things like drought and climate change and, say, a lack of pollinators. We are all part of an enormous ecosystem, and humans are extremely good at trying to narrow things down to their simplest form, which is not how nature works. So this increasing complexity and increasing diversity is an essential part of being profitable and productive in the future for humanity at large. And bees play a role in this, in that, you know, if you can give them homes and make them work, and look after them in a way that you can't as just wild existing species, then you're only adding to that system of complexity that is the natural world. So as Agventure, I'm kind of giving you the kind of company breakdown, because it is important to understand how, you know, in terms of us being young people out there, what it actually takes to be profitable, and how do you make a difference at the same time, because the world has got itself into the position it has by seemingly exclusively focusing on making money, regardless of the impact that has on our natural world. So obviously I'm back in the farming context, which is, you know, you've got to start at the field level, and understand your soils and understand your environment, that you then build knowledge on top of, in terms of what grows and how it grows and what it requires to grow, inputs, etc., and developing that market, that allows you to earn money, that allows you to fund the rest of the wheel. So it's not as simple as put beehives, grow canola, everyone's happy. It's extraordinarily complex trying to manage diversity, which is why I think we default to oversimplifying things, at, again, like I said, usually enormous cost to the natural world. So one of the things that, or the main thing that Agventure did when it decided to come into play, looking at monoculture failing largely, was the transition to conservation agriculture. And for those of you that, well, if I can ask you all to kind of close your eyes and imagine, you know, 1,000 hectares of wheat, and how do you keep that soil alive underneath that wheat? And the answer is, well, there are core principles that are relevant to us and what we do here in kind of a dry land area. We do not have subsidies, so there's a zero subsidy system in Kenya. We don't pay farmers to farm. They have to earn their own money, unlike, say, Europe or some of the developed world. And that is the kind of the longest game you can play to ensure your own sustainability, is to look after the soil. So again, the bees in the soil are inextricably linked in the sense, in the kind of day-to-day work that I do. So you have your crop rotation. So again, we discussed the moving from just wheat and barley to your peas and canola. Now we're looking at sunflowers, we're looking at linseed, chickpeas, maize, sorghum, oats are in there too. It's, yeah, the more the better. The more bits of food we can fit on our plate, the healthier the system is going to be. So minimum till is another part of it, trying to kind of maintain that soil structure and the soil life. Ploughing up here, it does have its place occasionally, but we've seen that as soon as you dig into the soil and expose it and throw it around, you're breaking down the most fundamental layer on which human existence entirely depends. If you think about it, everyone needs to eat. If you're lucky, it's 3 times a day. If you're not, it's less. But we all eat something that comes from the soil. Ultimately, even if it's, I guess there are those that are growing food in test tubes or in aquaponic system, but at the same time, the majority of the food today still comes from soil that we are disregarding at the most extraordinary level. So yeah, trying not to rip up your soil and keeping that soil covered. So you're keeping your residue from the crop in place. And then I have a spelling mistake there, controlled traffic, which is basically trying to, that word should be controlled traffic. So instead of driving your tractor willy-nilly all over the field, you are following very specific GPS markings that mean that you only tread on one bit of the field, because I don't know any soil system that can survive with 600 or 2 tons worth of machinery driving over it every few weeks. And the same analogy of the body, how many of you can eat or drink or be happy if you have half a ton of weight on your chest? We are so good at disregarding this most fundamental living thing, which is the soil. It's such an extraordinary, complicated thing. Let it breathe and let it drink and feed it is what it comes down to. So I think when you, and I hope I'm not drifting too much because it is a huge complex topic. So I will keep coming back to bees. But it is about how do bees fit into a commercial environment. And this picture is of a world record breaking barley yield. It was after 3 years of drought or very suppressed rainfall. The very little rainfall we had, we received at exactly the right time within that barley season. So it really yielded. It was about 12, it was just under 12 tons a hectare, which for dry land, non-irrigated barley is, like I said, a world record after 3 years of drought. So, only 10 years into improving the way we farm, we're seeing the results in seasons that are less than ideal. Next door farmers that haven't moved to conservation ag got 0 tons per hectare. So it's a real reminder of where we've come from, and what we must maintain is our core. You can see on the back, on the kind of the right hand lower side of the screen where the combine has finished, you can see all that beautiful soil cover that will be left in place, and the stubble, they call it. So that's the kind of crop residue that is left on the ground to be digested by the soil to keep it covered and less exposed to sun and wind and heavy rain. And it's such a basic principle. And yet in other places of the country, every single last scrap of straw is baled or removed, or animals are allowed to graze off it. And yet we're still, the next couple of months, we would ask the soil to perform again and to give and to give and to give, and receive nothing in return. So when I talk of crop residue, that is what I'm talking about. It's that beautiful organic matter that is just left for the soil to do what it needs to do, which is usually eat it and digest it and turn it into ultimately yield for the next season. So a little picture from a field day. Obviously, this kind of knowledge, certainly in this part of Africa, but I think overall is held in the hands of so few. So those that are lucky enough to receive the knowledge and the privilege of knowledge, I should say, on how do you improve your yields and how do you keep kind of harvesting even in less than ideal conditions, whether that's drought or flood. We need to share that knowledge. It's the most powerful resource that we have as a species. So this is one of my teammates in the field on a big field day. We truck in farmers from all over and we try and kind of share the gospel, as it were. So it's just more a kind of broader picture of what we do. We don't I made the mistake of once just putting out some empty bee boxes in the field, so for farmers to kind of make the link. Obviously, we work with wild African bees. I think the Americans call them killer bees, because they're extremely aggressive. So we don't usually include, or we don't put them in as demos. But a colony of bees moved in the night or the evening before our field day, and they were very excited, and farmers were very excited. And yeah, it was it was another one of those days, I guess. But yeah, ultimately we do share knowledge on the bees. This was that field day, so looking at all the different crops in the rotation. And you can't see our bee colony in that, but it gives you an idea of what we're trying to tell, what story we're trying to tell, with all the different crops in the background, and then within our trial sites, that kind of, they're like the mini version of what it is that we are trying to showcase to farmers out there. This is a canola crop. For those of you that don't know it, the crop around this trial site, the yellow, and the yellow in the background is canola. So it's an amazing bee forage, as is sunflower, which is another key crop of ours. And here we are with a bunch of farmers talking about the benefits of canola in the rotation, as well as what other value addition can you do. And bees are bees and the canola honey, it's this beautiful creamy yellow substance. It's not runny. It kind of sets like lemon curd or kind of melty butter. It's quite a unique taste, so not everyone likes it, but for those that do, it's a very valuable product. We only sold locally our honey, so we have a brand called Pure Mountain, and we sell sunflower honey and we sell canola honey. And farmers out there were pretty interested in, oh wow, there is an extremely valuable resource, this canola, not only for the rotation, but what you can spread on your toast in the morning as well. So that's a huge canola field, in flower. I would say one of the challenges, because it's not all rosy, is that that flowering happens for about 3 or 4 weeks, and then you've got to figure out how to sustain your colonies on either side. So out of flowering season, you are managing in the bees' eyes, a bit of a desert. We're quite highland where we are, so high altitude, between 2,200 and 2,600 meters, so very high altitude. So there's a lot of the crop margins, so along the edges of the fields, we've tried to put in a pollinator mix, with a whole bunch of diverse clovers and phacelias and vetches and sunflowers. But again, you're playing with a very narrow flowering window. There's not a lot of data on African bees, which is already a bit of a generic heading. But I know in Europe, they say you need an acre of flowering plants to sustain one colony. So probably the African bee is slightly less, maybe because they're just less productive. You need a lot of food to keep colonies alive. So one of the challenges was what happens outside of this beautiful, picturesque flowering window, and ultimately what are the costs involved in maintaining those colonies. So we do sugar feeding, which is not my favorite, because you're supplementing an extremely diverse diet with sugar, which isn't going to be good for anyone long term. And then the other challenge, I would say, looking at this beautiful picture and the reality in the background, is the African bee itself. So they are very prone to, or they're genetically wired to stay very small in size, in terms of colony size, and to split often. So that's how bees reproduce. They produce a second queen, or 3 or 4 queens, and then the colony heads off to colonize somewhere else with that new colony. And it means you never, it's very hard to build up numbers, which is what you want when you're looking commercial. Some of the other challenges we have are some of the diseases that are coming in. So I know we have terrifying disease that is spread by a mite called Varroa destructor. And it just looks like a very small mite or tick, and it latches onto the bees, and it sucks their hemolymph, which is insect blood, and it can take out entire colonies. I know of a bee farm or a bee entity just down the road. They had 1,000 colonies, which is already a huge number, and they were wiped out by Varroa a couple of seasons ago. So yeah, it's not all just pretty pictures and hopeful stories of how you make money out of honey. There are very real challenges to this. And I did mention also the extremely aggressive nature of bees. So working our bees are, as much as I think of them as my friends, they'd kill me if I didn't have my suit on. So yeah, you've got to go in and perfect as best you can your lightness of touch and trying not to cause too much issues. But at the end of the day, we go in at the end of the flowering season and we take all their honey. So I'm, the rosy picture of the happy beekeeper is so, but ultimately it's another extractive exercise, and the best you can do is to do it with respect and to cause as little harm as you can. So that is in how you set up your bees and your hives so that it is minimal extraction, kind of destruction, and always leave the bees with enough for them to carry on with. So it's such a delicate art, and again, it is not talked about enough when someone is talking big commercial money making activities, and it is just the reality of where we are as people in a commercial world. How do you do it with 1 foot on nature's side as well as 1 foot in a profit making world? So this is one of our colony sites. My bee team is in the background, getting ready for an evening harvest. So what we try to do with this siting is we've given each hive enough space between boxes, so that bees don't get confused. You can see very vaguely the different colored entrances. So just to help the bees differentiate their home from their neighbors. It's right there by the flowering canola. It's facing, all entrances are facing the sun, so we can get them up and off to work as early as possible. And they're on stands which keep them off the ground to avoid pressure from ants, and any other insect that may otherwise come in and cause challenges to the bees themselves. We do have honey badgers that sporadically come in, and they are unbelievably destructive. They basically rip the hive apart. But in recent years, we also have had challenges from two-legged vandals, so humans that come in. There is a local market here in Kenya, and I think elsewhere, for a local brew called Moratina, which basically involves honey, water, and the brood itself. So that's baby bees, and they basically mix it in with a bunch of herbs, and it is an extremely potent beer, and it's just extremely destructive. They take out the whole colony, and there is, I think it's the saddest day I've ever had, are those that you come in and a hive has been vandalized, because you do get your stray bees that have lost their queen and lost their home, and they've got nowhere to go. And it's heartbreaking. So yeah, I don't want to paint too negative a picture for anyone, but it's just to say that nothing in this world is easy, and perhaps neither should it be. But the principle remains the same. How do you contribute complexity to a world that we humans are really good at trying to simplify? And that is not an easy process. So here's another pictures looking up at the mountain. These were catcher boxes, so we set them out by the canola to try and catch new swarms, and they will come in. As I said, African bees split and swarm very often. It's how they reproduce, and our goal here was to try and capture some new colonies, and yeah, it's a wonderful thing when you catch a new colony just out of thin air. I know in Europe it's a completely different story. You can order your bees via catalogue, and you can choose the most productive queen, and she'll arrive in the post in a matchbox with 4 or 5 worker bees, and that's how you do bees in the developed world. Whereas we have this slightly reckless, wild, wonderful stick out a box and see what you capture. It is pretty hit and miss. You sometimes, each colony of bees is very unique, just like different humans or different dogs. They have their unique character, and it's a funny thing for people to get their heads around, because when you're talking of a swarm of bees, you're talking of up to 10,000 insects, and their characteristic is set by the queen. So the queen bee, as opposed to the Queen of England. And she can either be very aggressive or very docile or very productive or very hardworking or very lazy. So when you set out 50 beehives to try and catch colonies, at least 20 of them will never produce anything, just because that's their temperament. In terms of commercial offtake, 10 will be super aggressive and very productive, but you will have to work very hard to manage them. And then 1 or 2 will have a disease, or 1 or 2 will be amazing. So it's very, like I said, extremely different from, say, a commercial setup in Europe, where you mail order catalog your queen bees, and everyone is set on productivity levels and what you can expect. So it's kind of backyard beekeeping, even at scale here. And as I mentioned, sunflowers. I don't have any updated photos of the sunflower beekeeping fields, but over there on your right, you can see, gosh, 5 or 6 bees all floating around that beautiful sunflower, collecting pollen. You can just about see the pollen packets on their legs, which is how they, collect pollen. They get it all over them. They then lick their front legs and collect the pollen and shove it into baskets on their legs and carry it off to the hive. So whether you're looking in a canola colony or a sunflower colony, you'll pull out these beautiful golden frames, and half of it will be pollen, which the bees use to feed their brood, and the other half will be nectar that they then evaporate down to honey. And that's what it looks like. There's no pollen in that frame that I can see, but you can see that's a full, beautiful frame of canola honey, held up by one of my team. Makes me hungry just looking at it. And we put in, you can see how beautifully straight that frame is, because we put in a wax starter strip. And that basically means that the frames are easy to remove, easy to extract, and cause minimal damage, because so many African bee projects ignore that fact, and the bees decide to build their comb in a completely impossible way to extract. So yeah, we like to think that we have made some big inroads into the best way to harvest honey. And that's a range of our honeys. So over on the right hand side, you've got that very pale canola honey, and then all the way on the left, we have quite a lot of eucalyptus and wattle trees on the farms. So it's a very dark, very viscous honey. And then I think the other 2 kind of darker blondie ones there will be a sunflower one. I think that one's next to the canola. And then the other one, I'm not 100% sure. It could be a mixture, because obviously the bees are foraging all over. So definitely 100% canola honey on the right, and eucalyptus or wattle on the left. But the other 2 are kind of range. And that's the team in the process. So our different labelings, and in our brand new fancy honey room, with our whiteboard in the background that reminds us to smile and wash the car, as well as baiting and feeding, and apiary maintenance. So it is definitely a full-time job. whether you're harvesting or maintaining the colonies. And that's it in terms of pictures and the story. So I know we've got a little bit of time left for questions and answers, which I always enjoy hearing. So yeah, please, Robert, over to you if that's okay, to
Yes.
go into a bit of a Q&A session.
Yes, Jess. I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm a graduate of conservation agriculture in university, and I would say I'm an upcoming farmer, so I learned a lot from you. And yeah, I loved where you said when you were starting, you said profitability of the farm has to go along with its resilience, so that we can keep in mind the future profitability of the farm. So yeah, I really enjoyed your presentation. And for the audience, I would like to ask you to type your question in the chat section or raise your hand. If you can raise your hand, and you unmute yourself and ask a question. But I would go ahead and ask you a question. I told you I graduated in conservation agriculture, but the question we always asked ourselves was the applicability of conservation agriculture to smallholder farmers. Let's say a smallholder farmer wants to integrate a canola into his or her farm. Do you think we're talking about the commercial side of the farm? Do you think that would be profitable for that smallholder farmer? Because for the pictures I saw, every picture was of a large farm. So my question was the applicability of a canola into a smallholder farm. Yeah.
It's a really, really good question. And I think, first of all, I guess you've got to define smallholder farm.
Yeah.
In my head and in the Kenyan context, smallholder is kind of less than an acre, which makes it very difficult to plant something like canola, because you cannot be profitable on an acre of canola. But there are so many other crops out there that potentially you could use, or join up with neighbors to form a kind of conglomerate, so you have a broader area. But if you think about so much traditional agriculture, it's very polysystem or polyculture systems. So you have lines of sunflowers and a line of cabbage and a line of spinach, or potatoes, and each, I think, yeah, you've just got to come back to scale. So it might not be canola, but it could be different lines of different crops that have pollination opportunities in there. So many smallholders here in Kenya have lines of trees as the boundary, which can create habitat for insects, including bees, and depending on what you're growing, and its kind of pollen and nectar yield, could be used just as successfully as canola, because it's very hard to grow canola by hand, and certainly you're not able to harvest it. So I hope that answers your questions, or question in terms of small and medium and large. Canola is a medium to large scale crop, just because you need a machinery to put it in and to get it out.
Yeah.
But I have worked, and certainly my garden at home, it's tiny, 10 by 10 meters, and there's more bees in there than than anything, because there's so much diversity, all flowering at different times.
Yeah.
And it's probably better for the health of that bee to exist in many smallholder farms that are very diverse in their production, as opposed to a big crop that only flowers for 3 weeks every season.
Thank you very much. I saw in the audience some of my colleagues that we graduated together. I'm not sure if they are still in, but if they are still in, I'm sure they have some questions to ask. But if not, then we can take any other question from the audience. Yeah. CL.
Great, thanks, Robert. Jess, thank you so much for that presentation. Fascinating as always. I just had a few questions about sort of like general bee behavior. My first one is how far can a bee fly in a day, basically? Be interested to know that. And then also, I know that the weather in Tamau, well, for me, it's very cold and living in Naivasha. And I'm just wondering how the kind of the weather or the seasonality would affect bees and then the production of honey as well.
Yeah, really good questions. So in terms of how far a bee travels in a day, it depends. It does. So like it is so linked to the weather. So I'd say that the maximum a bee can travel in a single flight is anywhere between 3 and 5 kilometers radius around the hive, which is an extraordinary distance from, for a tiny little bee. But that again is impacted on how strong that bee is and how full its fuel tank is, basically, before it sets out, and can it get food and water along the way. So in the very cold or the very hot seasons, that distance would definitely drop. And then, the very cold times of the year at altitude, you see so much less progress in kind of colony production, because the bees have to keep their brood or their babies at 34.4 degrees. It's exactly the same temperature as the kind of average human body temperature. And in order to do that in the very cold times in a wooden hive, if it's been raining or it's very misty, they have to decouple their wings. So they basically, they unhinge their wings to stop them flying, and they basically shiver with their wings, and that generates a huge amount of heat, but at cost. And the cost is energy reserves and the kind of honey reserves, which is what they use to fuel that activity. And they all kind of cluster together. And bees are, they're extraordinary. They only live for 6 weeks. The worker bee, that is, usually because she works herself to death. Bees don't sleep. They've got to keep their colony warm. They've got to clean the hive. They've got to build wax. And so that energy supply that is honey is extremely valuable to their health. And it's only the excess that we take, and we call it excess. The bees see it as hard-won food. So yeah, I hope that answers your questions. In the very hot, obviously we do provide a lot of water, and we put lots of sticks and kind of stones in the water so the bees don't drown. But we definitely have to try and maintain as many of the conditions needed for prosperity as we can.
Wow, that's incredibly fascinating. I have actually heard about that, the decoupling of the wings in the context of sort of protecting the hive, like if there was an attack. I know in England there was a big problem with Japanese hornets or something, and I think I read something about them using that as a method to defend by basically like boiling the predator to death, essentially.
Yeah, they ball it. They will go around it and like vibrate and make it hot, and it explodes the hornet. So cool.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. But as I understand it, I think some of the bees in the middle also, they sort of sacrifice themselves because they'll also be getting too hot, I assume.
Yeah, no, bees are the most extraordinarily selfless creatures. Even when a bee stings you, it actually kills that bee, because it pulls out their inner organs. So that bee will happily sting a human just to protect itself. So they're very, very, very selfless creatures.
Wow, that's incredible. Thank you so much, Jess.
No worries.
So, Jess, if I would like to ask you a favor. There's among the challenges you mentioned, the life beyond the farm. It was a picture of a Canola farm, and you mentioned the challenge about life beyond that farm. And you said something about supplementing with sugar, and you said you didn't, you don't like it. If you can repeat on that section, and then instead of supplementing with sugar, what else would you suggest? Because you said you're not a fan of that practice.
Yeah, no, it is. I guess it's quite a standard practice for beekeepers all over the world to kind of boost colony strength just before flowering. the cheapest way to do that is sugar, which is a very simple sugar, like polysaccharide, or in terms of its chemical structure. And it is common practice, and I think done in kind of done for commercial reasons just before the flowering. It's not a bad thing. You're basically just getting your colonies as strong as you can. But as a long-term supplement, so if you're supplementing your bees for months at a time on sugar, you're only going to damage that colony, because it's such a it doesn't have the nutrition that, say, nectar does. If you think of a bee collecting from 200 to 300 different flowers in a day, and the makeup of all those different flowers, and the complexities of something that's far more natural in terms of nectar, and then you try and take that out and replace it with a basic sugar water mix. It's like trying to survive off Coke long term. One a day for a few days, okay, but you don't want to live off Coke, Coca-Cola, that is, for months at a time. So the other things that you can do is, like I said, we try and plant supplemental forage, so all around the field edges. We have perennial species as well as seasonal ones, so your sunflowers and your vetches, and then your trees as well, your perennial sources of food. And then you can, and we've been experimenting with a supplemental pollen mix, which is a lot more complex protein that the bees need. And we've tried making some out of soya flour and apple vinegar, and kind of a bit of a witch's brew, but it's never going to be as good as the natural one. And that's kind of it. Bees have a very simple diet, but you break down that simplicity into probably the most complex of all, in terms of trying to replicate nectar and pollen from wild sources.
Yes. For the audience, if you have any question, remember you can ask it. But in the meantime, I also have another question. We in our farms, when we were still at the university, we used to use traps for the insects, and these traps were mostly of yellow color. And I saw canola is of yellow color. So my question is, do we get so many insects and pests, or if there are also diseases in the canola, what are them, and how do you deal with that? Yeah.
Good question. Yeah, I mean, we've in terms of the disease suffered by the plants, we get there's quite a few fungal diseases that canola gets. Sclerotinia, alternaria, fusarium are some of the few off the top of my head, and they're fungal pathogens that spread in the air or in the soil that can really damage your canola. And then obviously, if your nutrition is not right, you get your nitrogen deficiencies, or your phosphorus or your potassium or sulfur deficiencies. That affects your crop and the crop yield. And ultimately, if it's got less yield, it means less flowers. So the bees also suffer from a weak or distressed crop. And then on the bee disease front, I mentioned a couple. With the sort of pest side of things, the varroa, but you also get all sorts of fungal infections of bee colonies if they're wet or very weak and can't keep themselves clean and warm. So you get a kind of mold that grows in the hive and can force a colony to migrate and abscond. And they get a similar range of coughs and colds and flus and weaknesses as we do. And you've got to be a bit of a bee pathologist to know all about them. But we certainly have pests and diseases that affect the colonies themselves.
Do you use sometimes pesticide? Because I know when you use pesticide in the farm that's near bees, then it can be hard for the lives of those bees. Do you sometimes use pesticides?
Yes, yeah, we do at scale. I'm not proud of it. I wish there were other ways, but at scale like this, with the products in the market, we do use pesticides. We are very, very careful in that application. So at flowering, when you have so many bees, we do not spray. So that's a big help, because you don't get so many bees or any bees in a crop when it's podding or pre-flowering. So that's normally when we would apply pesticides, usually for things like cutworms. Aphids are a big problem because they will also affect the health and viability of a crop. But yeah, we have specific windows that we do not spray just because of bee health. So that's, again, knowledge that is essential for anyone wanting to look after the natural world around them. Yeah, with the challenges of disease and pressure in a commercial crop.
I think this this discussion was very informative, and as Rubina James from the audience said, it was incredibly informative, and I loved it. As someone who wants to be a farmer, I was so inspired, and thank you very much for giving us your time. We hope to work with you in the future, and yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Thank you so much again, Jess. A really, really fascinating talk. And thank you everyone in the audience as well for joining. And just a reminder that the recording of this talk will be available in about a week's time on the Share Screen website. So feel free to rewatch it again and again and again if you want. Yeah, thank you so much.
Such a pleasure. Thank you guys too.